Hello and welcome to 20 Tactics, and this week you've got me, the Duke, and I'll be taking you through how to get the most out of your Bretonnian lances. Now, everything I talk about today will be assuming that the Bretonnian Knights will have devastating charge, as they do in the Triple Crown Wargaming GT Compact. So, in general then, there are two sort of schools of thought when it comes to how your lances should be used. First off is the sort of multiple small to medium sized lances of around 9 knights. Generally, in this type of lance build, you'll mainly see knights errant, simply because they're a bit cheaper. You could see knights of the realm too though. The main advantages of this style of list is that while all of the lances can do a fair amount of damage on the charge, particularly with that devastating charge that they gain in the GT Compact, they are all fairly cheap, so the loss of 1 or 2 won't be too much of a loss in points or your overall hitting power. Really, because I'd expect there to be maybe 6, possibly 7 lances of around this size. It also means you can spread your power out across a much sort of wider area of the board, giving you more board control and more threats for your opponent to have to deal with, either with chaff or spells or shooting. And sometimes something as simple as making your opponent focus on multiple targets rather than one bigger, harder to deal with target actually makes them maybe make a mistake or not put enough effort into dealing with each of those individual threats. So this type of list will obviously lack any real ability to sort of grind in a combat, with your maximum static res being probably 3 for 2 ranks and a banner. If you choose the banner, you may not even go for a banner if the missions that you're sort of playing don't require them. Now, this isn't really a problem for Bretonnians, as they don't do that very well anyway, to be honest. What they do tend to do quite well is break units with their sort of overwhelming number of good to high strength attacks on the charge. As much as you will still have the good strength attacks with just one small lance, even with a combat character in, you're very unlikely to break through a sort of decent sized unit. So this type of list does really rely on getting multiple lances into one target at the same time to do any sort of meaningful damage. That's not to say the other type of list doesn't also look to do that I'll look at in a second, but without the extra bodies and the additional ranks for potentially breaking steadfast that come with having fewer larger lances, you are much more susceptible to getting your lances caught out on their own. The flip side of that is that you don't mind if you lose a lance or two, as I've said before, as long as you can then capitalise on the unit that just beat your lance, maybe being out of position and isolated itself. From my experience, this is the less common of the two sort of main builds that you see competitively, though that's not to say it's the worst. I actually think both are very good in different scenarios. One thing I think this sort of list would need to sort of balance well is its characters. And by that I mean you need to really stay with the fundamental principle of the list that no one unit is so many points that losing it will likely cost you the game. And so you don't really want any sort of super expensive characters over 200 points really. 250 points would be the absolute maximum. If I could keep all of my characters under that, I absolutely would. I also wouldn't put multiple characters in the same unit if I could help it, again to keep the overall cost of those units down as much as possible. So the second main way to run Bretonnian lances then, as I've sort of hinted at, and I think which is the more common way, is in larger sort of 12 plus knight units. Now this generally means you'll have 3 lances at games of around 2,500 points. You might get a 4th in if you go up to say 3,000 points. Now personally, I normally run one of each flavour of lance wielding knights, so that's 1 growl, 1 errant and 1 realm. But there's nothing to stop you saving some points or getting a few more bodies by running a second lance of errants instead of the realms, or vice versa if you'd rather some knights with slightly better stats though less models. So what are the advantages of this style? Well, with the larger units comes better static res, as well as the ability to generate more attacks in those crucial first rounds of combat, thanks to the lance formation. Now, I think this is quite a key advantage, personally. Most of the time when you think about sort of any other army, really, apart from Bretonnians, when you add additional models past what you're expecting to have in the second rank, or even the third if you're thinking of running your unit in a horde, then those points that you're spending aren't giving you any additional output. All they're doing is helping to maintain the output that you've got for longer. and give you a bit more static res potentially. Bretonnians are the exception here, and I really think that's something worth capitalising on. So for every 3 models you add to a Bretonnian lance, you get another 2 knights able to attack in that first round of combat when you charge. So as much as you are still paying for the 3rd knight for no additional output, you are at least getting most of those additional knights still attacking, no matter how long the lance is. And with Devastating Charge, that will be a minimum of 4 additional attacks per rank you add on. 6 additional attacks if it's Ground Knights. There are of course negatives though that come with this style of play. Longer lances means potentially less options when it comes to deployment, particularly if you have some sort of large impassable terrain in or just outside of your deployment zone. It will also mean those lances are significantly harder to manoeuvre and therefore easier for your opponent to flank. And Bretonnian lances getting flanked is just about an absolute death sentence. Like 99% of the time you're going to lose that lance, probably that turn. Getting charged is bad enough, but being flanked as well, yeah, just say goodbye to that unit. And that conveniently brings me on to another major negative for this sort of playstyle, and that's because you have fewer units, each one is going to cost more than each individual lance in the previous playstyle, probably quite significantly so. And that means the loss of one early on or a crucial point can really be devastating and really hamper your chances of getting a victory, or even squander them completely, depending on when you lose it and what exactly you lose. It also means the rest of your list, the sort of non-knight elements, I think should look very different. Now, in this style of list with the larger lances, you need to invest in some specific chaff, and if possible, chaff clearance. Now, whether that be mounted yeomen, or skirmishing archers, or if you're using Our Monsters Compendium, maybe it's a single unicorn or 2, maybe a combination of some or all of those together. I think you need this more in this style of list because, well, 1, your opponent will likely have enough chaff to make it very difficult for you to get multiple lances into an important unit of theirs at once, and 2, you need to protect your lances from any counter charges that could come their way, way more than you do if you have multiple smaller lances. So at the end of the day, if you're running sort of lances of 9 maximum, you could just use them as chaff. There'll be about 200 points-ish without any characters, depending on which flavour of knight you go for, which really isn't too much to throw away to protect something more valuable. And speaking of those characters in that first style of list, if they're all under sort of 200 points-ish, you can use them as chaff as well. At the end of the day, that a single model is really good chaff as well. And if all you're doing is clearing your opponent's chaff, they'll probably do it. If they're a paladin, they'll probably kill 5 dogs or make them run away at least. This is certainly the more common way of running Bretonnians competitively, but that's not to say that people haven't had successes with the first style, not at all, or even a mixture of the two. Maybe 2 large lances, a couple of smaller ones. I think you run the risk at that point of being too, for want of a better word, flip-floppy, but it definitely can be done. Personally, I prefer to run my Bretonnians using the second style, so my list, as I'm sure you've seen on the channel, will likely have 12 or more Knights Errant, about the same Knights of the Realm, then a lance of 10 Ground Knights plus at least 1, normally 2 characters in there, normally a Wizard and a Paladin, normally my BSB to be honest, but any sort of form of combat character will do, and that makes them up to a 12. Plus I'll have another couple of characters spread across the Errants and the Realms. I really like what this gives me, which is 3 lances, each capable of doing a really good amount of damage on the charge, and no lance being significantly more expensive than another when you include the cost of those characters too. There are of course downsides, like I've mentioned, but there are downsides to basically any list in Warhammer, though it is hard to think of many major downsides to certain dark or high elf builds, come to think of it. I think the deciding factor though in how you play with your Bretonnians should come down to your personal playstyle at the end of the day, how you like and get the most out of playing the game. If you like having big units that can work relatively independently, that has a couple or more characters in there, then I would definitely recommend the latter playstyle. If you prefer to play where everything is in its own way sort of disposable for the greater good, with no obvious single targets for your opponent to go for, then go for the first list. If you're a bit in the middle, then maybe have a mix and see how that works out for you. So I hope that this has been at least a little interesting and who knows, maybe somewhat helpful. Thank you though for joining me today on 20 Tactics. Head back to the Night of the Realm mustering ground where you can check out all of our other exclusive content, but for now we will see you next time.
Remember to tag your friends and like, subscribe and share. Then head over to triplecrownwargaming.com and become a Knight of the Realm today.
What are you doing, mate?
You alright?